May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio Podcast. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, doing our bit to help preserve the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths cross his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So today we have part 2 for Jean Ross. Last week I read what there was in Crooked Cucumber about her, and then I started reading what there was in The Windbell about her and from her. And she wrote many pieces in The Windbell about her experience in Japan. She, as we covered last week, she went to Japan in 1963. Shunryu Suzuki sent her there. To Eiheiji Monastery, and where she got ordained as a priest and sat in the zendo with the monks, and really had an amazing experience. There were very, very few Westerners studying Zen in Japan. A few more studying Rinzai, like at Myoshinji with Yamada Mumon. Brian Victoria, I think, was studying Zen back in 63, and his teacher was Tatsugami, Sotan Tatsugami, who was the priest at Eiheiji, the Ino, in charge of the Zendo and discipline and ceremonies, who later came to Tassajara in the 3 practice periods in 70 and 71. When I'm through reading her pieces in The Windbell, I then go through and, read anything that was in The Windbell, because I took everything from The Windbells that had to do with her, and it's on that page for her in Cuke.com. And so there's, after I've read the last piece with her, I say, oh, here, she helped with the library, and there she did so-and-so. Don't quit at that point, I suggest, because at the very end, I read a piece I wrote about her for The Windbell in 1997, and, what happened with her. And I think you might find that rather interesting. So, I'm going to continue reading. We're going to take up where we left off last week. And this is from a Windbell, May 1964. More by Jean Ross about her stay in Japan. It has been said that modern man tends to regard nature as something exterior to himself. Supposedly, he is so intent upon analyzing it scientifically to prevent potential disasters or to modify its forces to meet his own ends that a sense of separation develops. Perhaps there is some truth in this. However, there are many people today who wish to emphasize not separation, but our oneness with nature. Zen Buddhism is a help in this respect because it has always taught that there is a basic unity between man and all other forms of animate and inanimate life. Most of my life has been spent in a city, and prior to my trip to Japan, I was an apartment dweller in San Francisco. Here the weather is of uniform pleasantness, and one hardly notices a change in seasons. In Japan, she should say there. Oh, no, here she's writing from San Francisco, right. That's true. I wrote a song once called San Francisco Has No Weather. In Japan, to continue with Jean, in Japan, while living in the Soto Zen temples, I rediscovered facts new to me, but old as time, sitting and sleeping on the floor, separated from the outdoors only by shoji screens and sliding windows. I not only observed the changes 4 seasons can bring, I also felt them throughout my whole being. Life at Eiheiji had a fixed schedule from the time of arising at 3:30 a.m. until bedtime at 9 p.m. It was a well-balanced schedule, but sometimes hard for a Westerner. Language difficulty, intense introspection, and adaptation to a different culture can create great pressure. I sought to be, pardon me, they put the, this calligraphy of Suzuki, they put right over the page in the windmill. Oh, I sought to balance this pressure, so near my room I kept some serviceable shoes and rubber boots. During a free period, I would quietly slip down the hall, down the numerous stairs, through Samon Gate, that's the entrance gate, out toward, in the windmill itself, it's not hard to read because they have the contrast between his calligraphy over the print, the words you're reading, just right. But when it's scanned, we actually scanned all these things twice, I thought, pages like that, because it's hard to scan it with the right contrast, and so some of these it's so dark it covers the words, but anyway, we will soldier on. Jakoin, burial ground of the Eiheiji patriarchs. Was I lonesome, frustrated, or tearful? If so, the time spent by a stream, watching the foaming water surge over the rocks, cleansed me. Or standing in the white silence of deep snow, my spirit would feel renewed. Jakoin was always quiet, with its crumbling moss-covered stones. An aura seemed to surround the place. There was a small shrine at the rear, and if I sat to one side of it, I felt hidden and at peace. Often I would turn my head to see if someone was near. It was as though friendly ghosts hovered in the vicinity. During the summer, when I walked to the temple, I would sometimes be awed by the adventure of passing through a field that teemed with white butterflies, or I would pause to observe an ebony-colored scorpion with red legs and red antennae. The Zen priests approved of this interest of mine, and they encouraged it. One night there was a commotion in the hall. I was called out of my room to find that some of the young monks had caught a horned owl that had swooped in through an open window. I was able to stroke this soft-weathered head and gaze at close range into his yellow eyes. On another occasion, a priest tossed a firefly into my room. With delight, I watched him as he flew, glowing like a flickered candle, until at last he was lost in the crevice between tatami mats. This closeness to nature often made me uncomfortable, too. In the cold weather, I dreaded to leave my hibachi. I constantly sniffled, and I was badly frightened by an earthquake, which happened several times during one day and a night. I had visions of it starting an avalanche of snow. In the summer, it was humid and hot. Even at 4 or 5 a.m., the perspiration would roll down my face and neck. Since there were no screens or netting, the insects would be a nuisance. It was difficult to meditate in the evening with mosquitoes buzzing nearby, and many a night I lay awake, irritated by their hum and waiting for a new bite. Once during July, a group of doctors from Nagoya and myself, plus several of the Eiji priests, visited a small temple some distance away. We were to stay a week for purposes of study and meditation. Most of the daytime was taken up by lectures, but every night we practiced zazen till 9 p.m. One evening I was quite tired. I was having trouble with my breathing and my chest hurt. The sound of hard-shelled insects throwing themselves against the shoji screens began to unnerve me. Then we got up for kinhin. The pace, that's walking, zazen. The pace was somewhat slower than I was used to, and insects struck against my face and body. I found myself swatting them away from me, and I was close to panic. At last it was over, and I hurried to my room, which I shared with 3 other women. 2 priests were close behind me. I had no sooner sat down on the tatami when one approached with unsmiling face. He said, "I have a gift for you," and he placed a large helmet beetle at my feet. "Is it alive?" I cried at their retreating backs. All 4 of us women watched the insect with fascinated horror. But when he began to move his legs and the pincer-like appendage on his head, I became strangely quiet inside. He was just a beetle, being a beetle. I took a piece of tissue, picked him up, and took him outdoors, where I placed him on the ground. The panic was gone. Soto Zen priests react to the changes of nature just as they do to the changes in man. They identify themselves with both in an even flow of interdependence. As for me, I stood on the Eheiji earth, and for the first time I felt planted in earth. I began to recognize Buddha nature not only in man, but in all forms of life. Such expansion eased the pressure of adjustment. And for those of you horrified that she is using the word man to stand for human being, that used to be standard. So, all right. And then in the wind bell of September 1964, we have A Mountain Walk by Gene Ross. Oh, let me say something. I want to get all these wind bells. We've got them all on Cuke.com. I want to get them all, just typed out. So we'll still have the images we have, but I'd like to get them, just transcribed without them being JPEGs of the pages of the wind belt. That would be a nice project. Okay. A Mountain Walk by Gene Ross. In a Zen monastery such as Eiheiji, all of a trainee's behavior and reactions are under close observation. One acts and reacts in an intimate group situation that reveals patterns of behavior. Each Zen priest seems to hold up a mirror, and I found that I too was observing because I could not turn aside from the views of myself reflected there. Since I could not speak or understand Japanese except for the simplest words and sentences, there were emotional flare-ups. Often there was confusion about the timing of services, taking of baths, any and all directions. One day in the Zendo during breakfast, a priest came over to correct my behavior. I was sincere in not understanding what I had done wrong. I showed my confusion in a way that demanded explanation, and I was amazed that the results of the explanation were unsatisfactory. At lunchtime, as we were waiting to be served, an older priest stepped into the Zendo. During the entire meal, the young monk next to me was subject to blows and harassing reprimands. Each blow, each reprimand passed from him to me until I silently screamed, "Let us alone." However, it was a lesson not only on how to accept Eiheiji discipline, because the young monk remained quietly poised throughout, but it had a deeper significance also. In the past, life had disciplined me in a manner I could not accept, because no amount of my applied reasoning or logic had explained some of the happenings that I considered undeserved afflictions. Perhaps I had demanded too strict an accounting of the karmic law of cause and effect, because I had regarded myself as a separate individual. Now, as someone else took punishment due me, I was embarrassed and ashamed. If I was part of humanity as a whole, would I ever again draw such clear lines of demarcation about what I deserved and what I did not deserve? One more occasion, anger acted as a beneficial stimulus. This particular morning, I was asked if I wished to take a walk in the mountains. I readily agreed, although I was surprised that great emphasis was placed on my wearing trousers. At 8 a.m., 2 of us set out to meet the rest of the group. The route was unfamiliar, and the narrow path treacherous as it wound along a stream. When, with kerchiefs around their heads, machete-like knives strapped to their waists, and heavy boots on their feet, they told me, "This is the mountain," while pointing to a sheer, perpendicular ascent of tangled, dense brush. My first impulse, arising from stunned disbelief that this was expected of me, was to refuse and leave. Then I became angry that I had been placed in such a situation. Finally, I determined to try. At least they did not ask me to clear the brush, as they were going to do. So I laboriously started to climb. The only way I could manage was to test one branch at a time to see if it would bear my weight, and then pull myself up slowly, hand over hand. I concentrated solely on this maneuver, pausing to rest occasionally when I found a big tree trunk to rest against. It was dark and quiet, with the sky obscured by foliage. Soon I had moved off on a tangent from the workers and was leaving them behind. When I arrived at a small clearing, I perched against an old trunk, basking half in sun, half in shade. It was warm and peaceful, with the hum of insects and songs of birds to cheer me. I could hear the noise and occasional voices of others below me, but I made no sound. Let them wonder where I am. I told myself after a while they'd begin to call my name. I ignored such summons for a considerable time, but I finally relented and replied. I was told to join them. So reluctantly I left my tree trunk and slid down on my fanny as the only means of travel. As it was, I slid under a huge pile of brush they had been cutting, and it took quite a bit of effort to extricate me. Rather impatiently, they put me on top of a pile and told me to stay there where they could keep an eye on me. At noon, we all made our way down to the stream, washed happily in the water, and then ate lunch. The group approved of my behavior that day. I did too. A flash of anger had generated the energy for me to accept a challenge. Acceptance of that challenge without verbal complaint gave me a dignity which lasted even as I was sitting under the brush. Sonozen priests at Eiheiji or elsewhere are deeply concerned about their students and disciples. However, they can never relax their discipline. Such discipline opens the minds of the students, strengthens, and eventually sets them free. And then here, all right, moving on in the Windbell. You know, this has every mention of Gene Ross, this page in the Windbells. News. This is Windbell 64, November, December. Pat Harrisoff, Gene Ross, Dick Baker, and Graham Pesci are all studying Japanese this semester. We have had postcards from Joe Lopresti in Japan and Norm Stiegelmeier in Germany. I knew Norm Stiegelmeier, but Joe Lopresti, I don't remember him. He was probably gone by the time I didn't get there till 2 years later. So here it has Wednesday night lecture, a schedule of speakers for the Wednesday evening lectures. January 6th, Reverend Suzuki. January 13th, Gene Ross. The 27th, Reverend Katagiri. February 3rd, Reverend Suzuki. February 16th, Graham Pesci. You see, back then in 64, Gene Ross and Graham Pesci were the two who, Graham Pesci had been to Eiheiji at that point and back too. Gene Ross was there before him. And, you know, it looked like they were going to be the teachers that came out. But many things happened after that. Graham went back to Japan, back to Eiheiji, then got more involved on Taiji, and then got involved with teaching, a language school, business, then went to England, and he never came back to Zen Center except to visit. But he lived, in the mid-'80s, he came back and lived there, and he and I became very close, and both lived in Sebastopol, and from the mid-'90s on for a number of years, and I stayed close with him until he died. God, how long ago was that? Like 10 years ago or something. I was here in Bali when it happened. Anyway, here's another piece by Gene Ross. Jukai by Gene Ross. During the month of April in Japan, the week-long service of Jukai is held at Eiheiji and Sojiji monasteries. During this period, commencing April 23rd and lasting through April 29th, lay persons participate in the giving and receiving of the Soto Zen precepts. It takes a great deal of effort and work to prepare for the many visiting priests and the 250 to 300 laypersons who attend. I was at Eiheiji at this time. Along with the young monks, I helped distribute futons, sleeping quilts, and pillows to different parts of the temple compound. How awkward I was trying to manage 2 futons draped over my head and shoulders. The young monks could carry 5 and literally run up the stairs with them. The lay people were to eat and sleep in the Hato, the Dharma hall, where morning and evening prayers were held. While the priests had separate quarters, when all was in readiness, there was one last ritual, and only a few honored persons handled it. The image of Dogen, which usually remains high up on the altar in the Choyo Den, Dogen's mausoleum, had to be transported to the Hato. The afternoon and evening of April 23rd saw many hundreds of people descend upon Eiheiji. The next morning we meditated as usual at 3:45 a.m. and then joined the others in Hato. She didn't say these, she just says in Hato. That's from being around Japanese. They don't have articles, A, and the. There were 3 teachers in charge of Jukai. Upajjhaya for preceptor, Anusasacharya or Sila, precepts instructor, Kamacharya or guide for laymen. The ceremonies performed the first morning and afternoon were repeated each day. They included Raibutsu and Tanbutsu, which honored all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of all the world in 10 directions, plus the patriarchs. It should be of all the worlds in 10 directions, plus the patriarchs. Kaldan Fugin, the chanting of the sutras to pay homage to Shakyamuni Buddha, Manjushri, and Maitreya. Nidai Son Ken Shuku Fugin and Nidai Son Guki Kangu, which honored the second patriarch, Ejo Koun. Etrai Shido Segaki and the Mokafugin, which were memorial services for ancestors, preaching of the precepts by one of the 3 instructors in charge, which usually occurred in the afternoon, and Danjorai, prostrating oneself before the Buddha 24 times. Since I had not been assigned any special duties, and because leaving early would have meant my passing through the laypersons who filled the space to the doors, I stayed through all the services. The latter lasted for 4 or 5 hours before a break. Oh my gosh. So it was a sesshin of seiza, a kneeling position of sitting on one's feet for me. She should have said sitting on one's shins, the knee down, the seiza. Seiza means something like proper sitting, right sitting. I attended some of the instruction in the afternoon with one who could translate, but was also taught the 16 precepts on the side. On the evening of April 27th occurred a most impressive ceremony called Kange Shashin, or Sange Shashin. It was the ceremony of confession and repentance. Each of the participants wore a special white vest or robe. That might not be vest. A special white vest or something, or robe. Yeah, there's more calligraphy on this. And we were, I think when my dear friend Warren Lynn copied all the wind bells in Fort Worth after my mother died, while I was going through the house, he came to my house from work every day, and I had boxes of stuff for him to scan. I bought a scanner just for it, and he did that for like a couple of weeks. That's why we've got all this stuff on Cuke.com. Well, that's one of the reasons why. There's been a lot of scanning outside of that. All right, but anyway, so here they're having a confession and repentance ceremony. Each of the participants wore a special white vest or something, or robe, and we were lined up in rows before the Hato altar. To the sound of chanting, we silently walked one by one down a dark hallway, at the end of which sat the preceptor by a lighted candle. We repeated the words on a slip of paper which had been given us. Shozai Muryo. That we handed the paper to the preceptor, did the gasho, and departed. We had confessed that we had been in a state of darkness and that we had committed sins without number. When all of us had performed this ritual and we again seated in the hato, a huge bell was brought in and the slips were burned. Then the priests in colorful robes circled the hall, ringing bells. It was a symphony of sound that obliterated all thought, and an ancient pageantry of great beauty. Thus it was, our sins were banished, and we were confirmed in our Buddhist faith. I'll bet some of you out there are squirming to hear that. People love ceremony, and yes, and that can all be said in a way that you would find more digestible. Like the word sin really just means missing the mark. It's it's going the wrong way in your practice or something like that. And look, living in Bali, I can tell you, people love ceremony. Just sitting still. I mean, what is zazen? To me, zazen practice is being still and quiet. It's doing nothing. And, that's just not enough for a lot of people. It's just, being yourself and adding nothing to it. But I live in a place where there's ceremony and there's offerings constantly. It's just part of the life. It's not intellectual at all, I'll tell you. That's the way it seems to me. Anyway, as Jean continues, on the next evening, the eve of the anniversary of Dogen's death, those of us receiving the precepts were again lined up in hato. A row at a time, we stood up and circled the altar, finally climbing up on the altar itself, while the instructors made the circle before us. Their chant translated has this meaning: a person is inevitably worthy of Buddha through the confessing and receiving of Buddha's precepts. It has been proven that he can find his Buddha nature within his mind, and that he is truly a part of Buddha's posterity. Thus, we received the 16 precepts. The morning of the 29th included special services honoring Dogen, and his image was returned to Joyo-den. The many priests and visitors began to depart, and soon Eiheiji seemed quiet and empty. During Jukai and afterwards, I felt a heavy responsibility, particularly when some of the priests called me Buddha Ross. My imagination ran riot on all the reasons why I could not identify with Buddha. I had established deep affection for the priests of Eiheiji, but I held Buddha apart from man. This was forgetting a most important lecture. Buddha himself would never forsake his role as a human being. He never claimed to be man and God. To do so would have created a barrier between himself and his followers. The path to enlightenment was difficult without man feeling he must be divine to accomplish it. Well said, Jean. There was another realization after Jukai. 2 different priests on separate occasions had remarked, "Mind is everything." This statement had long puzzled me. Beset as I was by many physical problems, then I asked questions about it. The answers never satisfied. One night during Zazen, I felt an answer that brought satisfaction. During Zazen training, at some point, Buddha's mind fuses with the intellect, emotions, and body of the trainee. This mind is neither masculine nor feminine, since it permeates all things animate and inanimate. The result of the fusion is man's recognition of true self. Once this recognition occurs, one is always conscious of Buddha nature. However, the small self can temporarily dull our consciousness. We are fortunate that within each second, each minute, each hour, there is an opportunity for Buddha nature to renew itself in all its brightness. Wow! Excellent, Jean. Thank you. Okay, here we are. Windbell, March 1965. Nyunanshin by Jean Ross. Nyunanshin. The serious student of Soto Zen Buddhism must display considerable commitment to his Zen master, to Zazen, and to other Buddhist practices. The degree of commitment may be the student's worst enemy, since attachment or avidity for success, even spiritual success, can create evil. If one is sincere, one has a strong desire to please and an eagerness to prove its devotion. This may lead to self-consciousness and anxiety. A good Buddhist must learn to accept the progress he makes and be satisfied with it. This is not passivity. It is accepting the results. After continuously trying one's best, it is performing small acts of devotion and being pleased with what has been accomplished. I can remember when I first came to Sokoji, what pleasure it was to watch the movements of Reverend Suzuki Roshi-sama. Ha 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 ha, there's Sama. They didn't say, we never said Sama, it's in the Japanese. Sama is, it's like San, you know. The Japanese names have San, but it's more polite. Reverend Suzuki Roshi-sama, with what ease he performed his service in the Zendo, and with what care he made us a cup of tea. At Eiheiji Monastery in Japan, I found the Zen priests had the same quality of fluid movement from one task to another. The simplest act was performed in the spirit of Nyunanshin. The word expresses the equality of understanding, compassion, and tenderness. It includes love, but goes beyond it because it is not possessive. Dogen, the founder of the Soto sect of Zen, said it was one of the most important things he learned during his study in Japan. I have written and talked about the many difficulties a Westerner faces when he studies Zen Buddhism in Japan. The discipline seems harsh, and coupled with the intense introspection of Zazen, it causes emotional and physical upsets. Zen masters represent life. They confront the student in all types of situations until he learns to understand himself and learns how best to resolve life's problems. The laws of life do not change to suit the individual. Neither does the Zen master. However, he does display Nyunanshin, and he does show by his own behavior the importance of performing each task as a part of Buddhism. For several months at Eiheiji, I was privileged to study sumi painting with Reverend Akaburi Roshi-sama, who was considered a very great Zen painter. Watching him make a stroke, I felt that his truth was but an extension. No, I felt that his brush was but an extension of his hand and arm. His art was never, looks like turned from him. I don't know what it is, as I feel it is from some of the modern artists. Instead, it welled up effortlessly out of creative depths of his being. This was the result of years of devotion to the practice, but not only of art, of Zen Buddhism as well. Although I had never used a brush before, I was singled out for special attention. Reverend Akaburi would demonstrate to each one the mistakes he had made. His sign of approval was a red circle. Only twice did I receive such a mark, but when I did, all his other students rejoiced with me. One day, Reverend Tatsugami Eino Roshi, she should say Aino, at Eiheiji, invited 8 of us to his temple for a bamboo sprout digging party. His temple lies in the midst of a bamboo grove. Wisteria grows over the gate, and there is a small vegetable garden. When I first saw the sprouts, all I could think of was pineapples, because they look like pineapple tops poking out of the ground. The ability to dig successfully lay in scooping a pit around the sprout and then lifting it out unbroken with one blow of the spade. We worked most of the sunny afternoon digging and carrying the sprouts to the truck which had brought us to the temple. Along about 4 p.m., we gathered about a low rectangular table to partake of a most delicious meal which included many delicacies and some of the fresh sprouts. The Ino Roshi is a most stern disciplinarian at AAG. Now I saw him as a congenial host. He was an embodiment of the sayings, when one performs ritual, one performs ritual. When one works, one works. When one eats, one eats. In every situation, he performed as a complete human being. In mid-October of 1962, it was arranged for me, 1962, she went there in 62, far out, yeah. It was arranged for me to visit Reverend Fujimoto Roshi-sama, whose temple lies between Osaka and Kyoto. After a night's train ride, I arrived early the next morning. Reverend Inoue, a follower of Reverend Fujimoto, met my train. He was a serious but pleasant young priest to whom I responded immediately. We went directly to Reverend Fujimoto's temple. Reverend Fujimoto turned out to be a slender, stern-faced man who belied his facial expression, or so I thought, with a childlike simplicity. I felt completely at ease and talked freely for several hours that first afternoon. The next day, the three of us drove deeply into the mountains to Reverend Inoue's temple. It was nestled in the hills and was surrounded by a lovely white wall. I had my own room overlooking the rice fields. It was harvest time, and I awoke each morning to a rustling sound, the cutting of the rice. We stayed there 10 days, and most of the emphasis was placed on Zazen. For the first time, I began to realize the significance of studying with Reverend Fujimoto, and I began to realize his tremendous power. At times, I could not determine whether it was he who was breathing with me or I who was breathing with him. Discussion periods followed the zazen, and I found myself becoming mute. It reached a point where I couldn't converse normally or even ask questions. Finally, Reverend Fujimoto withdrew from me. He never showed his face, and one day he abruptly left the temple. Reverend Inoue did not comment on his departure, and he did not act as though there was anything strange about it. It puzzled me greatly. After 2 days, Reverend Inoue informed me that I should write a paper on the state of my zazen mind and that I should have it ready for Reverend Fujimoto's arrival the following morning. Although I was stunned by the task, I complied. After the two priests read it, we had a long talk. Reverend Fujimoto said I must abandon all thoughts of an individual self. My mind henceforth must be free and unattached to anything or anybody. Above all, I must realize that the center of the universe at any given moment is everywhere. I visited Reverend Fujimoto Roshi-sama on 2 other occasions. His last words to me were, "Thank you for showing me your Buddha nature." Even after 2 years, I can think of no adequate reply to this remark from one of Soto Zen Buddhism's greatest Zen masters. So let each of us proceed slowly, feeling satisfied with each small task that we perform well. It will be a dubious compliment if someone looks at one of us and says he is enlightened. The true compliment will not have to be spoken. It is the presence of one of us, another human being, feels an emanation of new Nanshin and realizes he has made contact with an open channel through which enlightenment can flow. Wow, pretty good. Thanks, Gene. Fujimoto was Elsie Mitchell's teacher, and she put out his book, The Way of Zazen. And, you can actually buy it, I think. It's on kook.com, the whole book. It's only 25 pages long. We used to be able to buy it at Zen Center for like, who knows, maybe it was like $1. So here I see, going through what's in the Wind Bell by Jean, I see she's to speak on September 5th of 1965. Here's a notice. Says a guy named, never heard of him, named Ralph Wire on his way to Hawaii and Japan, and he's going to AAG. He's going to enter AAG. He'll be the fourth member to study at AAG. Never heard of him. Ralph Wire. I mean, I must have read this before, but I don't remember it. His three predecessors are Gene Ross, Graham Pesce, and Philip Wilson. 1967. New library head. A news item escaped the last Wind Bell is that we have a new head librarian, Lynn Warkoff, who took over the job from Trudy Dixon last September. The small library, which was started in the early days of Zen Center, was resuscitated in the spring of 1965 by Gene Ross, Pat Harrisoff, and Trudy Dixon, who reorganized it last summer with the help of Lynn and many volunteers. Here we see Gene Ross listed as a contributor toward the purchase of Tassajara. Here we see in 68, she's on the board. The other was 67, 68, and notice in the Wind Bell. Suzuki Roshi has appointed the following board of directors: Richard Baker, Tim Buckley, Claude Dallenberg, Silas Hoadley, Bill Kwong, Gene Ross, Peter Schneider. There's no limit to the number of directors, but there must be at least 5. The board meets at least every 3 months. So, Wind Bell 1969, Priests, is at the end of it. Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, Zen Master, Dining Katagiri Sensei, Instructor, Koben Chino Sensei, Ryogen Yoshimura Sensei, Assistant Instructors, Richard Baker, Claude Dallenberg, Philip Wilson, Mel Weitzman, Gene Ross. Novices. Zen Center Board of Directors, 69 fall. That's when Gene was the Shuso. Can't call her a novice anymore. Richard Baker had been Shuso. Claude Dallenberg had been. Philip had been. Mel had just gotten ordained. And Zen Center Board of Directors, 69, Richard Baker, Tim Buckley, Claude Dallenberg, Marion Derby, Silas Hoadley, Bill Kwong, Yvonne Rand, Gene Ross, Peter Schneider, Dan Welsh. And here in the 1970-71 Fall-Winter Wind Bell, there's a list of 5 practice centers associated with Zen Center, and one of them is Carmel on Dolores Street near 7th, above PG&E Office Apartment 4, Gene Ross. I used to go sit with her there when I was out. And here we see in 1972, Monterey Soto Zen Group, Gene Ross. And here's a mention of Gene in the Wind Bell. There's a picture of her with Suzuki Roshi, Gene Ross, Oksan, and the Japanese visitors in San Francisco in 1961. And here's a comment from Della Gertz. I met Suzuki Roshi in June 1959 when Dr. Kato brought him to our class in Zen Buddhism at the then Academy of Asian Studies, and Ellen Watts was the dean at that time. What I remember especially about that evening is that it ended with everyone getting on the floor around the room, facing the wall, and Suzuki Roshi teaching us to meditate. Betty Warren and Jean Ross were there. Later, we were in the first lay ordination ceremony. It says, Jean has a number of entries in the Early History of Zen Center article. It says, in 1969, while Suzuki Roshi was still alive and Zen Center was still at Sokoji, Peter Schneider compiled a number of interviews for the Windbell into an Early History of Zen Center. This project is interesting now for both what it says about Zen Center's earliest years as well as the perspectives of 1969. And here Jean Ross says, for some time he was really all alone by himself. As you know, the Japanese congregation wasn't too demanding of his time, and he was just waiting for the Sangha to come and want to do meditation. Bill McNeil and his wife were the first ones to arrive. Della and Betty and I had taken a course in Zen Buddhism at the American Academy of Asian Studies. Fall of 68 to spring of 59 from Dr. Kato, and he had Reverend Suzuki come lecture to us. When the semester was over, we asked Dr. Kato how we could continue, and he said, well, you met Reverend Suzuki, and he's starting a meditation group at Sokoji Temple in San Francisco. Why don't you go and see what it's like? All right. Now I'm skipping Bill Kwong, Della Gertz, Paul Alexander. This is good. I should come read this whole thing. Jean says, we felt a little more secure when Oak-san came, and then when he turned over his Japanese temple to his son. All priests have temples of their own, and they're responsible for them. When they're absent, they get a neighboring priest or friend to substitute for them. And of course, Suzuki Roshi did that for quite some time before his son took over. Jean says, the master-disciple relationship didn't come into the picture as strongly as it does now, that people want closer contact with him. We had close contact in the early days. There were only 8 to 12 of us, and on Saturday mornings we'd each bring some kind of food. I used to bring milk and eggs, or just the eggs. Bill Kwong was the cook. It was a closer and friendlier atmosphere then than it is now. But that's also because of the size. We didn't eat in the Zendo, we ate in the kitchen, which I liked. When we sat at the table with him, we could watch every mood that he made. Now it's difficult in the Zendo for a lot of people to see him, and besides, they're supposed to be looking down. Whereas at the table, we could watch him fix tea, watch his facial expressions, gestures, etc. I still wish some of those more intimate relationships could be present. Here she says, before I went to Japan, I didn't think in terms of the group as Sangha, and I don't think other people did really. Bill Kwong might have, and Bill McNeil was thinking of becoming a priest. But there wasn't this group feeling of there being a Sangha. Not at all. And we all read the latest books on Zen Buddhism, but not too much of the technical knowledge. Nowadays, people are talking about the sutras, but most of these translations are new. Of course, even in those days, Roshi was lecturing just as he does today, and it was his lectures that we were following. And here she says, my first session, I thought I would never get through, and I got awfully mad because I was so uncomfortable. There were several pillows under me, and at one point I just got up and threw one across the room. In a few minutes, Suzuki Roshi came back quietly and put another one under me. And here Jean says, I can remember during one session, he left us and said he was going to be gone just about 20 minutes. It was Sunday, and he was going to lecture to the Japanese group. Well, anyway, it wound up with our having to sit for about an hour and a half. We were all so furious at him because even after he'd gone, he'd sent someone to tell us he'd be back in just a few minutes, and we'd gotten our hopes up. But he left us there, and we sat. He was very, very strict about our not moving. He really growled and caused a lot of trouble if we didn't sit absolutely still. I don't think he's quite as strict on us as he used to be. For instance, he was very, very firm that we'd be in the Zendo on time. Once Bill Kwong was one or two or three persons who were late in the Zendo after the work period during a session, and Suzuki Roshi told him to get out. If he couldn't be there on time, he shouldn't be there. It was very hard on Bill. He sat in the office until Roshi would let him back in. Here we see. In the fall of 1959, Betty and Della began going regularly in the mornings, but I could only come 3 times a week because I was living in Oakland. I can remember at that time that all of us were quite in awe of this early morning hour because it was something entirely new to us. Those that came that fall were Charles Sigford and his wife, Bill Kwong, Betty, Della, myself, Bob Hance, and Bill McNeil and his wife Lou, and Roger Malik. Bill McNeil was the spark plug and quite a drawing card. He had a vivid personality, the sort of person who had a kind of following and was a good administrator. He also wanted to go to Japan and subsequently did go in 1960 and spent a year or more studying in Buddhist temples and also did some teaching English. I don't think there was any one person as leader when Bill left, but Betty was as saving a figure as anybody. She was a tremendous help to Suzuki Roshi because he could rely absolutely on her being there every single morning. Bill must have come back the fall of 61, but he didn't have much to do with Zen Center from then on because he wasn't too happy with his experience in Japan. He had planned to become a priest, and everyone counted on this. When he changed his mind, he felt he should leave. Okay, that's everything in the wind bell that I have marked down from her. But there's one last thing I want to read you. It's a piece I wrote for the 1997 Windbell, 97.2, page 46, on Jean Ross, Surpassing the Clouds. I said she was a real Buddhist. This is an introduction to the article. It's just something I wrote in the Cuke. She was a real Zen Buddhist trailblazer, one of the first women and Westerners to study Soto Zen in Japan, especially at Eiheiji, the ancient monastery founded by Dogen in the 13th century, and she was one of Suzuki's first disciples. It's a sad story, though. We have just discovered that Jean Ross passed away on January 15th, 1996, in Marin City, Michigan. There are few around these days who would remember Jean, but she was one of Suzuki's earliest and most important disciples. The child of Prescott and Alice Ross, Jean was born in Detroit, Michigan on August 16, 1916. Her mother's father was a Methodist minister, and she had a strong Christian upbringing. We know very little about her life because she didn't talk about herself much, but she did say that her interest in China and Japan began when she was 15 years old, and that from then she read everything she could find on that part of the world. Suzuki wrote on her curriculum vitae, I think it's on his, that she studied the doctrine of Christianity in college and also was reading about Buddhism at the time. I don't know about her having any CV. Just a week or so after Shunryu Suzuki first arrived in San Francisco. At the very end of May 1959, Kazumitsu Kato, his part-time assistant at Sokoji in Japantown, brought him to meet his class on Buddhism at the American Academy of Asian Studies. There, Suzuki met Jean Ross, Betty Warren, and Della Gertz. They immediately took to this new Zen priest who said very little, had enormous personal charm and presence, and who taught them how to practice Zazen that evening. Before long, they were going to Sokoji at 5:30 in the morning to sit Zazen. And of the original group, only these three through the years. Only these three continued through the years. They were pillars of the early days before Zen Center. It's before Zen Center. The Zen Center was founded in 1962, helping to support Suzuki both financially and with their constant presence in the Zendo. Betty and Della had started going later on in June, but Jean didn't join in till the end of the summer when she got back from a trip to Europe. She was a nurse living in Oakland by Lake Merritt and had no car, but she managed to be in San Francisco 3 days a week. She went to the Wednesday evening lecture, joined the Saturday morning schedule of zazen cleaning and breakfast, and stayed over for the Sunday lecture. Eventually, she moved to San Francisco so she could be in the Zendo every morning. Jean had some trouble with sitting on the floor, but she persevered. In a 1969 interview with Peter Schneider for the Wimbledon, Jean talked about her first session, revealing her direct, no-nonsense point of view. I still have a temper, you know. I can just swear just like that. But anyway, I got awful mad because it was so damned uncomfortable. I don't care what they say. If you're on the heavy side, this is pretty hard. It's my own fault. If I just pushed myself away from the table, I could be thin like Bill Kwong. There were several pillows under me, and I got up and thought, these aren't doing a damn bit of good. And in just a few minutes, Reverend Suzuki came by quietly and put up another one under me. Laughing. Suzuki had enough confidence in Jean to support her desire to go to Japan to further study Zen. After a sayonara party held for her by her fellow students, she left in March of 1962. There she became one of the first Westerners and women to study at Eiheiji, the oldest and largest monastery of the Soto Zen sect, and spent more than 7 months practicing there, longer than any foreigner had been there before in Eiheiji's 700-year history. I'd be careful about saying that now. She was close to, but it might be true, she was close to Sotan Tatsugami and spent several months studying sumi painting there. Jean also studied with Rindo Fujimoto, who Suzuki considered one of the few great living Zen masters. When Suzuki went back to Japan for the first time, Jean spent time with him at his temple Rinso Inn and returned with him in July of 1963. She wrote about her experiences in a series of articles that appeared in the Windbell. One of those articles described her participation in a demanding week-long lay ordination ceremony, Jukai, but she had already received the Buddhist name from Taizin Kumazawa, the abbot of Eiheiji, in a private ceremony. She said that one of the points of that ceremony was to turn her into a man so she could practice there. When asked if she felt strange being in an all-male monastery, Jean replied, "No, I feel that basically all human beings are alike. We have the same instincts, and I reacted to the Japanese people just as I would to our own, as people. I met them on an individual one-to-one basis, and as far as being in an all-male monastery, well, that had advantages and disadvantages. Sometimes it's hard for a woman in a situation like that, but also they were very good to me. Anyway, I had a very warm relationship with those I studied with. In fact, I feel They knew me better than my friends and even my family here in the States because there was a very vital life at Eiheiji. When she returned, Jean continued her study with Suzuki. In 1965, she and Grampechi, who had gone to Eiheiji after Jean, became the first and only students to share the Wednesday evening lecture schedule with Suzuki and Katagiri at Sokoji. In 1968, a year after Tassajara was founded, Jean moved to nearby Carmel and started her own zendo with the blessing of Suzuki. In the fall of 1969, at the urging of Suzuki, she had the position of Shuso, head monk at Tassajara. She didn't want to do it, she said. She'd done her monastery time and was more interested in a low-key approach to Zen practice, sitting once in the morning, reciting a brief sutra, and going about her day as they had in the early days at Sokoji. So insistent was Suzuki that she do it that the prior spring practice period had no shuso. He wanted her to be shuso then, but she had a commitment. And he said, well, you can be shuso and take care of that commitment too. She said, no, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it 100%. So and I say that's the only time that ever happened. He said we had to wait for Jean to take her turn, that her ordination had actually preceded all the prior shusos. So she did it. Suzuki considered that she had been ordained as a priest for him by Kumasawa while she was in Japan. It's unclear what the nature of that ordination was, but to Suzuki, who was not a predictable stickler to formality, she was a priest. When she returned to Carmel after the practice period, she began to wear priest robes for her weekly zazen group instead of the old-fashioned pressed flowered dresses and rakusu she had worn up to them. Jean's devotion to Suzuki and his to her could not keep her close to the Zen Center as it grew into an institution too large and impersonal for her taste. She felt that students were becoming dependent on an institution that was not fostering their strength as much as being their security blanket. She resigned from the board because she felt that Richard Baker was still running Zen Center from Japan. Yvonne Rand remembers reading a letter from Baker to the board which had to do with various decisions they had to make. Jean was upset not only with the board, but with Suzuki. She felt it was not right for Baker to be in Japan and for others not to have the opportunity to develop and lead. When Suzuki was dying, aside from her sadness at his condition, Jean became distressed that Baker was coming back to be the new abbot. She had been an early fan of Baker's and was the person who nominated him for president of Zen Center to succeed her early in 1966. Oh, is that right? She was in awe of his organizational and fundraising abilities, but she could not accept the direction that Zen Center had taken. She felt it had become too competitive, goal-oriented, impersonal, unfriendly, and hierarchical. She liked the people individually, but had lost her love of the collective. Jean, like everyone who had been there back then, missed the intimacy of the early days when things weren't so serious and they'd have time to get to know each other and see samurai movies together. Yeah, so Koji, there was a Saturday night Japanese film for the Japanese congregation, and Suzuki would sit up in the balcony and watch them, and other people would go watch them. I got in on the tail end of that. So Jean says, now they're striving to do more than another person or get more attention than the other person. You see, in the early days, and I think that's still the very, very best, it was different. Reverend Suzuki in the early days never talked, and he still doesn't, to my knowledge. He really knows what he's doing. He never talked about striving for Satori. The master-disciple relationship didn't come into the picture as strongly I don't think, as it does now. Not because of people not wanting close contact with him. We had it. I mean, there were only about 6 or 12 of us. We ate together and we sat at the table with him, for example. We could watch every move he made. Now it's sort of hard for a lot of people to see him. At the table we didn't talk much, although I'd get off into giggling fits half the time. We could watch him fix tea for us and stuff like that, and it was really good. But anyway, one of the most important things he talked about, as far as I was concerned, was you practice zazen without any thought of return, without any striving after satori or anything else. It wasn't that Jean wasn't interested in the practice and just wanted a nice social situation. Here she's describing what it was like in the Zendo with Suzuki back then. I think he was more strict in some ways. For example, he really growled and caused a lot of trouble if we moved. He was very, very strict on us sitting still, absolutely still, and he'd jump on us if we'd moved. I don't think he's quite as strict on us as he used to be. Before Suzuki's death, Jean encouraged Katagiri to come to Monterey to teach there. He'd been the person at headquarters in Tokyo who was responsible for foreigners back in 1962, and he met her at the airport and took her to Eheiji. Later, she visited him and his wife at his temple, Taizoin, not far from Eheiji. Katagiri came to Monterey in December of 1971, right after Suzuki's funeral. Jean's group merged with his, but in the summer she informed him that she didn't feel comfortable with his formal style and all the zazen periods and sessions. Katagiri didn't last long there anyway, and in December of 1972, he moved with his family to Minnesota, where he taught for the rest of his life. Soon afterwards, Jean left for Minnesota, having informed her students that she had obligations. This is a mistake. She went to Michigan. I got to fix that. Having informed her students that she had obligations to take care of, she encouraged them to keep sitting and to go practice with other groups if they could. Jean was well loved by all who knew her, and her students were no exceptions. She had quite a modest style, though always spoke her mind. She was gentle and kind and seemed to care more about you than herself. She was an old-fashioned lady in the way she spoke and dressed. She'd obviously never been a beatnik or a hippie. She wasn't much up on the new ways of thinking that had become common ground for the young seekers of the times, but people would ask her for advice. One young female student of hers remembers, she wasn't trippy, she was pragmatic and wanted us to have a grounded practice. I was pregnant and went to her about it. I didn't know whether to get an abortion or not. I didn't know what she would say. She didn't say anything about Buddhism or about precepts. She was sensible and direct and just tried to help me. She didn't tell me what to do. After seeing her, it was something I could deal with. I knew Jean back then, David. I'd met her at Tsukoji in 1966 and had lived for a while in the Monterey area and studied Japanese, and I sat with her there. Suzuki refused to let me have anyone sit with me and told me to sit with her and help her out, that she was the teacher and I wasn't. I got to know her a bit better during that time, and I kept up with her till she moved back to Michigan. I have talked to her oldest friends and some of her students from back then, gone over everything I could find on her and remembered in our relationship. And I feel that Jean left with a broken heart. Baker knows this, and he feels bad about it. One of Suzuki's final requests to Baker was to keep in touch with the older students, and he tried with Jean, but all he ever got in return was a manila envelope with her notes of early Suzuki lectures. She did not return her best friend's Betty Ardella's letters or cards or keep up with the Zen Center. In 1989, she sent the metal top of a hyakujo, a staff with rings that clangs when you walk, to be used for begging, and told beggars she didn't need it anymore. Occasionally, she would send donations to Katagiri's group in Minnesota. She sent a note of condolence to Tomoe Katagiri when her husband died. The only other person I know of whom she wrote to was Mark Lewis, who had started off his Zen studies with her in Carmel while a high school student. He'd gotten her address from Tomoe Katagiri. Jean had responded with a brief note to his letter, but not to the next one. In 1994, Mark passed that P.O. box on to me. I'd been collecting as much of the oral and written history surrounding Suzuki as I could, but I sat on it. I knew she wouldn't want to talk to me, and she had left quite a bit in terms of a record. But this year, 1997 in May, I decided to try to find her. I called the post office in Marin City, just outside of Detroit, and found that number was registered to a lawyer. I wrote to whom it may concern and inquired about Mrs. Jean E. Ross, as was written on a curriculum vitae that I had found with a pile of others, the Zen Center archives. Oh, so he did have CVs for students. That's right. The Mrs. was a mistake that Suzuki had written. She'd never been married. I had photocopied it a few years ago along with reams of other info. Her birth date was also on that sheet, and a private investigator used that info to check the death records for Michigan. A week later, both answers came 2 days apart. She had died over a year before in St. Clair County, Michigan. She had a Methodist funeral at the Algonac Funeral Home and was buried at Woodmere Cemetery in Detroit. I called the lawyer, a Mr. Foster, and spoke to his wife and secretary. Her husband had been Jean's family lawyer for some time. Mrs. Foster said they knew Jean quite well and that she would stop by the office at times just to chat, reminded her of Mrs. Santa Claus. She said that Jean had gotten Alzheimer's disease rather young and had to move to a nursing home in August of 1994. She died peacefully about 6 p.m. of January 15, 1996, in the company of a nurse who had brought her dinner. Mrs. Foster said that Jean never mentioned that she had been a Buddhist, but had brought up that she'd been to Japan. She had gone through Jean's personal effects. There was very little, nothing there to indicate Jean's 12 years of Buddhist study and teaching. No robes, no rakusu, Buddhist books, or personal papers. There was an unusual bracelet, possibly a Buddhist mala, that she specifically left to her niece in her will. For a year or two before her departure from California, Jean had said she had to go back home to take care of her old mother and aunt. Her mother had lived to be 105 and had died in 1985. Her aunt, Florence Potts, lived to be 110 and died in 1995. She spent most of her time with old friends at her apartment. Little by little, her old friends were gone. As always, Jean had lived frugally and had been somewhat concerned about her finances. She had the 3 of them to take care of. When her mother died, it was discovered that she had stock worth a great deal of money, millions. Jean was surprised to learn this, but did not alter her lifestyle one bit. She died a very wealthy woman with no need for wealth and left everything to her niece and nephew. Jean had made a complete break with her Buddhist past and finally with her human life, a life of learning, simplicity, and service in which she seemed to have continued to apply the spirit of Buddhism like layman Pang without sentimentality or submitting to any particular form or name. Gone beyond her Christian name, Jean E. Ross, gone beyond the Buddhist name that Suzuki had written on her curriculum vitae in 1963, Ryo Wun, Surpassing the Clouds. This has been a Cuke Audio Podcast. I'm DC Pubav, Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sonor with Dog Bandita, Feline Manis, and dear lovely Katrinka. Rita and our granddaughter Lucia left a few days ago. We had a wonderful month with them, and we miss them. But I'm sure they join us in wishing you and all of us a grand awakening.